Okay, so for clarity, Thomas Wootton is speaking first on the con. Is everybody ready? Thomas Wootton negates contention one is an authoritarian showdown. The dynamic of Latin American relations has taken a dark turn. Clark 18 of Brazil Wire writes that the election of the far-right candidate Jair Bolsonaro has fundamentally altered the dynamic of Maduro's relations with Brazil because Bolsonaro is committed to the destruction of socialism in Venezuela. As a result, Clon's 2019 of UPIT confirms that the ideological clash between the two authoritarian leaders has resulted in a dangerous game in the region. Thus, Castaneda 19 of the New York Times writes that the conflict between the two leaders is a conflict foretold, with an invasion of Venezuela by Brazil and Colombia becoming increasingly conceivable. Already, tensions have reached an unacceptable threshold. Norton, foreign policy journalist for The Intercept, writes that 8 days ago, tensions between Venezuela and Brazil are at a boiling point, with Brazil's far-right government supporting military attacks on Venezuela in hopes of inciting a coup. Luckily, Lima 2019 of Bloomberg writes that while Bolsonaro despises Maduro, he has been constrained from invading due to northern Brazil's dependence on Venezuela dams and on the border for hydroelectric power. American sanctions on Venezuela have prevented Maduro from severing Brazil's dependence. Norton continues that Maduro was hesitating to cut economic ties with Brazil because he relies on food from Brazil's massive agricultural sector for his CLAP food distribution program. This program is critical to his regime's control. As read in 2019 of the CSIS explains that Maduro uses CLAP to starve off his political dissenters while providing food for his supporters, with 83% of food distributed to his loyalists. While Maduro relies on these economic ties to maintain power, he also recognizes that the same ties are used to threaten his regime. Norton furthers that the insurgency force funded by Brazil on the southern border, and as time goes, they will carry out larger and larger attacks with the goal of protracted violent insurgency against the regime. Maduro's decision calculus is very clear. He would rather sever these ties and risk a Brazilian invasion than wait for an insurgency funded by Brazil to launch a coup against his power. Lifting sanctions would remove Maduro's dependence on Brazilian food imports, allowing him to cut off Brazilian funding to the opposition. In doing so, he would remove any economic incentive for Bolsonaro to hold back from invading Venezuela. Unfortunately, a conflict between the two nations would be devastating. Gibson 19 of the New York Times writes that a military conflict involving Venezuela and Brazil would decimate the region, affecting millions and making the carnage in the Middle East seem like a watershed in human history. Our contention, too, is setting bad precedent. Venezuela's sanctions are unique, as Solano of the Wall Street Journal explains that Venezuela has escalated to a full-blown embargo, something only done 30 times in history. These embargoes don't work overnight. Wootton of Harvard confirms that it takes years of continued enforcement to cause political change. This is why, although there have been marginal concessions, Venezuela is far from fully implementing the U.S.'s demands. So, lifting the embargo 3 months after implementation without achieving demands signals that the U.S. is unwilling to follow its threat, eroding the credibility of future U.S. sanctions. Peterson of International Studies writes that lifting sanctions prematurely tells targets that failing to comply with demands has no serious consequences. He quantifies that prematurely lifting sanctions increases the probability of future ones failing by 91%. Maintaining the efficacy of sanctions is necessary for preventing global conflict. Elizabeth Rogers of the Center of International Affairs explains that sanctions deter and limit violence by imposing economic costs on those who perpetuate it. Hassan of Carbondale University confirms that sanctions increase the chance of war ending by 97%. History agrees. Rogers contextualizes that in places such as Haiti, Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and the Ivory Coast, sanctions have reduced conflict duration, resulting in comparatively less deadly crises. Bennett of American Science Review confirmed that for every year a single interstate conflict lasts, 280,000 people die, thus mitigate.
Can I see the 93%?
93%?
Sanctions increase something like
Is it the 91? You're at 91% and then
increases
civilian
deaths by 280,000.
And then after that, can I see that the invasion of Venezuela by Brazil is like a peaceful place?
Sure.
Do that first.
For context, it's the second highlighted part, but hazard rate means decreasing it. Second highlighted part. And then you want Brazil invasion feasible?
Yeah.
Okay. don't really read evidencing explicitly what you want, but I can give you that right now they're constrained. They're not invading because of like hydroelectric things
Yeah,
like
that's
that.
basically only.
Sure,
that's
yeah.
fine.
So I get 14 seconds.
Jordan? Zane? We affirm contention one is breaking barriers. Lifting sanctions on Venezuela breaks 4 barriers to well-being in Venezuela and in Latin America. First is restructuring. Weisbro finds that Venezuela was attempting to restructure their debt prior to the placement of sanctions in 2017 by reaching deals with creditors to postpone payments in exchange for bonds. Unfortunately, sanctions preclude these efforts by preventing the country from participating in talks with U.S. financial institutions. Wigglesworth furthers that Russia and China, who are currently attempting to keep Venezuela afloat, doesn't have the resources to do so forever. In a world with sanctions, however, restructuring would occur. As Wheatley writes in 2018 that Venezuela is a profitable place to trade bonds, and investors are still interested in the region. Smith furthers in 2019 that Venezuela debt doubled following the placement of sanctions. He finds that a debt default is extremely likely in the year 2020, which would lead to a large-scale economic contraction. The time to act is now, as Mucci writes in 2019 that a debt restructuring would stabilize Venezuela's economy and lay the foundation for long-term economic growth, doubling total growth. Johnson contextualizes the last time Venezuela instituted recovery programs, poverty was slashed by 70%. Second is medicine. Sachs in 2019 finds sanctions to block access to essential life-saving medicines for Venezuelans by blocking access to funds needed to pay for them, thus dropping their imports over 5-fold. He finds that over 4 million currently lack the medicine they need. Lifting sanctions would resolve this, as Nebe in 2019 includes lifting sanctions would unlock $6 billion of frozen assets, effectively covering Venezuela's medical needs. One Trump in 2019 thus finds sanctions have resulted in 40,000 excess deaths in a single year, and that almost 300,000 more have been brought to the brink of death, isolating the lack of life-saving medicine and medical equipment. Third is Petrocaribe. Clickhouse in 2013 explains Venezuela launched Petrocaribe in 2005 as an energy block to provide low-interest oil sales to nearby countries facing expensive imports, allowing governments to pay for petroleum over time instead of all at once. During May 2013, leaders approved the Petrocaribe Economic Zone, which would promote investment, trade, tourism, and development in 18 member countries. However, Bobbin in 2019 indicates due to a nosedive in oil production and other economic constraints due to sanctions, Petrocaribe has rapidly deteriorated, shutting off the countries that want to continue Petrocaribe from taking part in it. Charles in 2019 concludes that U.S. sanctions have functionally killed Petrocaribe by hurting fuel supply, debt payments, and shipping possibilities. Thus, countries have avoided taking any transactions with Venezuela in order to avoid the associated risks due to the unclear language of sanctions themselves. Critically, the Caribbean Council in 2020 explains Maduro wants to revive Petrocaribe this year after the suspension of supplies due to sanctions. However, they conclude that it is unclear how the relaunch could be effective while sanctions remain in place because of the increasing pressure on the country and measures against other countries doing business with Venezuela. Crucially, the FAO in 2015 explains Petrocaribe was on the road to revitalize the whole region. The program combines social programs with productive development to take care of immediate issues of food security and deal with long-term underlying causes of hunger. That's why they reduced hunger in the region by 50%, creating a food surplus of 17%. The need to maintain and increase the efforts to overcome hunger has not gone away, as the UN in 2019 finds that over 39 million people in Latin America are at risk of starvation. Fourth is water. Jordan in 2015 finds that governments of Venezuela implemented new campaigns to fix water infrastructure that boosted Venezuelan access to clean drinking water to 95% as of 2015 before sanctions. Green in 2019 corroborates sanctions blocked the country from acquiring new pumps, motors, pipes, and replacement parts. Despite the Venezuelan government doing what it can to mitigate the situation, it has been impossible to buy pumps because anytime the country tries to buy supplies, the companies or countries try to help have been blocked by sanctions or they get sanctioned by the U.S. Even if Venezuela could get the money abroad, the U.S. has threatened to sanction any foreign company for doing business with the country. That's why Rendon in 2019 finds 80% of Venezuelans do not have access to stable drinking water. This crisis also affects farmers' ability to irrigate crops, so national production and agriculture has fallen 60%. This is a devastating long-term effect, as Nichols in 2019 concludes that 4.3 million people are in critical need of water. And Stott concludes that 8 million people lack access to food in Venezuela due to Trump's embargo, meaning millions will suffer irreversible damage. Critically, Heinz finds that in 2019 that the famine will cause hundreds of thousands of deaths within the upcoming months. Independently, stable water is good for the economic growth, as the CSD find that it will create long-term economic gains, which will boost the GDP by 3.7%.
We see a lot of evidence. Number one is on medicine, you say it would undermine assets. And then, I guess not a lot of evidence. And second one is there's 50% hunger. This is for my, I'll walk you assets. You want that first question?
Okay, so when we renegotiate Venezuela's debt, like, can you just walk me through what happens?
Yeah, so when they renegotiate debt, they push off the bond payments, then Venezuela can A, borrow more, but B, doesn't have to pay everything eventually, they can pay it off later, and that increases economic growth.
How does it increase economic growth?
Yeah, so when they have money to finance their operations, they can increase government spending, which according to macroeconomics,
Okay, do you get evidence saying that they do that?
that they will spend on government
Yeah,
spending.
because the warrant.
Yeah, so on the bottom of the case, when they, one, just increasing like overall like debt restructuring allows them to spend more, which government spending is just good. Second thing is that investors come into the regions, that's also a good thing. I mean, we can read independent analysis.
Sure.
And the last thing is that when Chavez did this in like, I don't know when, that it
Yeah.
slashed poverty by 70%. So
Okay.
yeah, we do read evidence. All right, let's go to your argument about the showdown, right?
Yeah,
So an intervention would destroy like infrastructure, right?
some, yeah.
So if it would destroy like the hydroelectric dam, what's the probability that they do it?
Well, no, the hydroelectric dams are in Brazil, not Venezuela.
Okay, so if Maduro goes to war with Brazil, they'll shut
No.
off his water, right?
But Brazil is gonna be going to war with Venezuela.
Yeah, will they shut off his, why can't they just shut off his water? Why do they have to go to war? Like, if they shut off their water, then they effectively
Oh,
like,
because they hate Maduro because he's a socialist. That's why the president, he's like crazy. He hates socialism.
so
He's
why
very far
why
right.
didn't they invade Chavez? Oh, cause he just got in
Yeah, he just got in
Okay.
office.
So, wait, with a quick follow-up, right?
Sure.
So, why would they go to war? Why can't they just cut off the water supply?
Because they're like, why Venezuela can't cut off the water supply?
No, it's Brazil's water supply, correct?
Yes.
So why can't they just shut off the water supply? Why do they have
No,
to go
it's
to war?
like they need the electricity from Venezuela, which is
So-
why they can't
So,
go to
okay,
war for this.
so the way this like water works, it's controlled by Brazil, but then it goes through Venezuela and then
the
back to
dams are in
Brazil.
Venezuela that give power to northern Brazil.
But the water is in Brazil,
It's
right?
in Venezuela.
So, okay.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about. Actually, you can have another question.
Okay, I'm still having a hard time understanding this.
Okay.
So, yeah, so the hydroelectric dams are in
Okay.
Venezuela.
Yeah. So.
So why would Brazil screw themselves over?
Okay.
Yeah.
Maduro needs food for clap from Brazil, which is why he can't cut it off. He can't cut off the power.
Wait, hold up. You said that the Brazilian leader hates Venezuela.
Yes,
So why don't they just cut off imports?
because they need power.
Okay, so then why would they go to war?
Because if they go, wait, let me make it very clear.
So
okay?
it's a mutual interest relationship. One needs power, one needs
No,
food. Why would they just
it's
say,
mutual.
oh, screw
Okay,
it, and
ready?
then go to war?
It's mutual interest right now, but when you're firm, they no longer need food from Brazil, so Brazil no longer has an incentive to like stop invading. So then they go and invade.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Wait, no, but Brazil's relying on the hydroelectric power.
Right, but they want to oust Maduro because he's a socialist.
But water comes before outing a socialist.
Do you want to read the evidence?
Yeah, sure. Can I see the evidence?
Hello.
Yeah. So it's gonna start with two OPs on the case on the case.
Two obvious?
Yes.
Are they offensive?
Kind of. It's like defensive offense.
Do I need a new sheet?
Probably should get one. If anyone needs paper, I have it. Is everyone ready? Okay. Let's begin now. The story of Venezuela comes from the CSIS. Threats that the root of the economic crisis was not sanctions, but rather Maduro's bad economic policy mismanagement of the economy, whereby inflation was 800% and food imports were down 80% pre-sanctions. This means that all of their impacts would have inevitably triggered. It was only a question of a few months. Fortunately, the negative is solved because the CSIS explains that targeted sanctions have strained the inner circle on Maduro, and thus the LRC claims that there's an 8% chance of him being out by 2020, which means that we are creating a sustainable solution, whereas my opponent's case is an economic bandage. But on top of that, the Wall Street Journal indicates that even if Maduro never gets ousted, the inner elites are also pressuring him to liberalize his economy and privatize, which is why inflation is down 1,000 times, and growth is projected to increase by 4%, which once again means we're creating a sustainable solution for their case. But secondly, we'd also say, on their argument about oil, their entire case, Venezuela is dependent on oil 95% of the time. This is problematic though, because oil is inevitably going to fall for two reasons. The first comes from the World Bank, who writes that as things like green technology emerge, the price of oil continuously drops, which means that Venezuela needs to get away from the oil sector. But number two, obviously the New York Times indicates that Venezuela has deep crude oil, which is super expensive to extract, so the way that they're selling it is they subsidize it by taking on massive debt loans. But the problem is, he concludes that eventually they will have a massive default that destroys the entire economy. Fortunately, the Washington Post indicates that economic pressure that have been put on the oil sector has forced them to diversify away, which is why the private sector, which includes things like agriculture and services, now compromises 25% of the GDP. Overall, the OECD indicates a 1% decrease in oil exports increases growth in the long run by 0.7%. Once again, the time frame applies here. Let's go to their case. On their first argument of debt restructuring, there's two responses. The first one comes from Gulati. He explains that unless there's actual real structural economic reform, the default will just happen on a larger scale. Later in the line, they're simply just pushing out the problem. They don't actually solve it. But number two, Gulati explains that for any large-scale debt restructuring, it would take an IMF bailout. However, an IMF bailout would only make the problem worse for two reasons. Number one is austerity, because it conducts things like cutting social programs. And the issue is austerity only works when countries have good economic growth. But when they're already so deep in a recession, it only causes more contractionary policy, which is what happened in the EU and South Korea. So anything, you actually turn their argument, you make the crisis significantly worse. But number two, the BC explains that IMF bailouts also deregulate sectors, which result in the speculation and privatization and stock markets opening on their land, which leads to people speculating. The issue is, he concludes that it was in the 1997 financial crisis was literally caused by deregulation within these countries. But specifically, even if they did debt restructure, this revenue would never be going back towards the economy for two reasons. Number one comes the CSIS. He explains that the inner circle are all drug kingpins who want the revenue to go back into drugs and illicit revenue streams, not back into the economy. But number two, Corrales indicates that Maduro keeps people poor on purpose because they don't want them to protest, and at a certain point, they don't protest at all if they're super weak, which is why he concludes that it would never actually go back to the economy. Let's go to the argument about medicine. There's an overall trend. The Washington Post indicates that's because of sanctions, aid actually increases into Venezuela for two reasons. Number one, the United States wants to look like a good actor, which is why they give in aid while putting on sanctions. But number two, Maduro was blocking aid, but the threat of sanctions forced him to open up, and now the Red Cross is sending in 650,000 worth of aid. This outweighs their case in two ways. Number one, you prefer over their solution because number one, the majority of imports that happen right now, 70% of it goes to corruption. But number two, he's only doing it for elections, which means that their case is once again an economic bandit. The aid is actually sustainable in the long run. But moreover, we say that you need dollars to import the medicine, so they need to win their C1, but they also have to decrease hyperinflation, or else they aren't solving their problem. But moreover, pre-sanctions, the shortage of medicine was already 9%, so they're not solving anything. Let's go to Petrocaribe. They always say that they want to continue restarting the Petrocaribe program, but the Washington Post indicates that oil production is so low that there's no reason why they would ever actually start it. It's just rhetoric from Maduro. Moreover, we'd also say that because the Petrocaribe doesn't actually sell at lower prices, they sell at market prices. They just paid over a longer period of time. But there are two implications. Number one, it makes countries very complacent about their debt problem because they think they can just pay it off later. This results in them being complacent, and it actually goes to things like corruption, which our evidence indicates that now, 10 years later, it's creating fiscal problems for these countries. They can't get out of recessions because their debt problem is way too big because Petrocaribe caused it. But number two, it stops things like transitioning towards better alternatives in the long run. In fact, he concludes that natural gas is no longer a viable option, but the New York Times indicates that natural gas will reduce energy prices by 40% in the long run, which means that we actually turn their case. Let's go to their argument about water. Two responses. Number one, the UN is solving, and there's 2.8 million people receiving water right now. Once again, we say this is only because pressure from sanctions. But secondly, pre-sanctions reservoirs were drying out, which means the water crisis was already going to happen. But third, our buyers of medicine also apply here. They need to get the water, they need to get the money, and they also need to decrease hyperinflation, or else it doesn't matter. Finally, the CSIS indicates that water technicians have all other countries. Two implications. A, none of them there's none left, but B, any that do left are, I still have time. Any that are left would actually just go to rich areas. Wait, I started the time. I definitely had more time left.
4 minutes and 6 seconds.
I really started.
Can we see a few pieces of evidence?
Yeah.
Can I see the fiscal problem or because of recession?
Yeah.
Can I see that this is a good actor?
Yeah, I got it. So I'm getting. I'm like compiling all that evidence.
First one. Alright, did it 8.
Yeah, how much time is that?
I did it 8. Almost 9, but we'll round that. Actually, that's 1.
Okay, so this is the fiscally destroyed because of debt. And then obviously the next one, the no, I said it's
start on the overviews, and then I'm going to be frontlining and then this, right? All right, guys, are you all good?
Yeah.
Ollie? Yeah. All three judges? All right. Kevin stands up here in rebuttal and reads to you two new contentions, but both of them are pretty bad. The first one is about regime change. First, Vote in 2019 finds that if regime change were to occur, it will lead to a civil war because the elites will always support Maduro and they'll lead to coups against the new government. That means that it's going to lead to more deaths. It's going to kill up to 1 million people. That specifically happens because of a regime change. But then Globe finds in 2019 that there's no chance of a regime change because of how much the opposition is weakened right now, because A, they don't have any money, and B, there's a lot of corruption claims. That means that there's no way that they're going to come into power. But then Ward finds in 2019 that these sanctions actually are a scapegoat for Maduro. That's why there's increasing support right now, because he's blaming the issues in Venezuela on the U.S. It gives him an outlet that's really easy. Going to the second one about dependency, a couple problems here. First, they talk about reforms and privatization, but Corner finds in March of 2017, that these reforms and dependency issues were being solved before sanctions were passed in 2017. But then Rockwell finds in 2019 that in order for you to actually diversify, you need a capital base. And when Chavez tried to diversify, the only way he was able to do that was with oil revenue. And because they don't have any oil revenue, they don't have a capital base to act as a cushion for diversification. Go on to our case. First on restructuring. First, they say that the restructuring will happen later anyways, and there'll still be a debt problem. They don't actually respond to our warranting. We tell you in case that these countries, that Venezuela is able to pay off this debt later when you lift sanctions, because they're able to sell oil as a collateral. What that means is that only when you lift sanctions can they pay off their debt. Then they tell you that an IMF bailout is really bad. However, first of all, we never said anything about the IMF. They just say that we do. But second of all, let's go on the actual arguments. First on austerity. We tell you that austerity right now is happening. And second of all, they tell you that austerity is only good with growth, but we actually lead to growth by decreasing poverty by 70%. Then they tell you that it leads to deregulation. However, the reforms are really good as food production is going down right now because of regulation, because producers see that they're not making money because of price controls and regulation. There's no way that they can make money. Then they tell you there's a illicit streams of revenue to sell, but actually we're able to solve this if we lift sanctions, because right now they need to diversify. Somehow the easiest place for Maduro to diversify is into illicit streams of revenue so by lifting sanctions we solve the issue. Then going to imports, they read a couple of responses. First, they tell you that the U.S. is a really good actor, but we looked at their evidence. It literally says that the U.S. is isolating Venezuela right now from the imports. That's our argument. Then on the Red Cross, realize that Maduro, just because he got one payment from the Red Cross, that's not solving for anything. Remember that imports are going down 5 times. They tell you that we need dollars, but we tell you that no, they don't. They can just buy it in bolivars. And then they tell you that and then they tell you that it was declining beforehand, but realize that it's gone down by 5 times. Then on to Petrocaribe, they tell you that they're complacent with debt and that there's fiscal problems because of recession. You can group both of them. We tell you that they have high debt anyways. None of their arguments are responsive. They just say that debt gets pushed down the line. That doesn't make them complacent. That makes them realize that they still have debt. It's not going to do anything. Then they tell you that natural gas will go down long term and it's going to be a lot better. But if it's more profitable, these countries will switch anyway. Go on to their case. On their first contention about an authoritarian showdown, there's a lot of bad warrants here. First, there's no warrant as to why the election, specifically in Brazil, angers Maduro. As Jacobin finds in 2019 that all of Latin America is becoming more and more right-wing. There's no reason why Brazil specifically angers Maduro. Also, tensions are increasing right now despite sanctions that are obviously not solving for an issue. Furthermore, lifting sanctions will actually lead to more trade worldwide, as Rendon indicates that other countries are afraid of trading with Venezuela under sanctions because they're afraid that the U.S. will then sanction them. That's important because this fear goes away when sanctions are lifted, which will lead to more economic connectedness. Then, for Martin finds in 2019, the Brazilian president says that people who negotiate with Maduro are fools. The issue is ideological and tensions will most likely always exist. Also, they tell you about this insurgency force, but the force is literally just funding small-scale terrorist attacks. They never tell you how that leads to regional decimation, even if they do progress. Additionally, they tell you in Crossfire that Brazil is relying on Venezuelan dams. There's no warrant as to why they would invade and ruin their access to these dams. You can say that it's a damn shame that there's no warrant here. And that Maduro always has the incentive of having ties with Brazil because he doesn't want them to intervene because that could cause a coup or regime change. He's never going to actually lead to tensions. Additionally, Brazil wouldn't invade because Russia and China support the region and would defend Maduro. They don't want to conflict with these two massive militaries. Going to their second contention about setting a bad precedent. A lot of problems here. First, there's full-on embargoes on many other countries other than Venezuela, like Iran and Russia. There's no reason why lifting sanctions on Venezuela specifically makes everyone more authoritarian when there's other countries that are being sanctioned. Additionally, the U.S. poses an inherent threat outside of sanctions. They're the most globally influential, both militarily and economically. They're always going to pose a threat. Then Davies finds in 2019 that in an evaluation of 115 cases, he concludes that sanctions have been effective in less than 5% of cases. That means that they're going to be ineffective regardless of what we do in Venezuela. Additionally, there's no warrant as to how sanctions deter violence. If anything, they increase violence because they make people angrier against the U.S. For example, right now, Venezuela, there's a lot of violence against protesters. In Russia, they're fighting back in the Balkans, and in Iran, they literally just launched a missile strike. The probability of it really goes clean to the app when you realize that we're able to solve for issues historically.
Okay, so I have the first question. Okay, so let's talk about our aid turn.
Yep.
You say that our subpoint B about how Maduro is pressured to let in aid is very small and it's not solving, right?
Wait,
On your argument about medicine, we do this aid turn, and we say that Maduro is blocking aid, but the threat of sanctions made him accept the Red Cross.
Yes, our argument is that this one accepting of the the Red Cross was literally just one like package of aid.
Right. So how much did the package feed? Like how many people?
I'm sure it fed people. That's not my argument.
The number I read during the rebuttal that you don't answer is 650,000.
Right,
What is the terminalization of your impact?
Let's talk about 650,000 people, right?
No, let's talk about the terminalization of your
I'm
impact.
getting to the terminal.
Okay.
Okay. So let's say I got a couple meals for 650,000 people, right?
It's lasting for months too.
I've been alive for 17 months. For 17 years. Maybe 17 months. I don't know. But the way that I've learned that things work, is that usually when you consume food, then it turns into poop and you don't need to poop afterwards, right? Food getting aid in one big package that feeds people for months, it still goes away. The only way to
Wait,
keep
it's not like the aid goes away after a day. Like they keep sending in aid.
That's not true at all. We know that.
Wait, so why did you say that during rebuttal?
The argument that I made is that I said specifically that
You said it's
Maduro
a small
accepted aid
package.
and that it's not enough to feed them long term.
Wait,
Our argument is the
why
only way to feed people long term is to allow imports. I'm gonna take the
Okay,
question.
no, really quickly. I just want to get a follow-up. Because you dropped the two warrants that I give for why we should prioritize this aid over yours. Because the only reason why Maduro would ever give aid to the people is for elections. That's the warranty that you dropped, which means that your medicine is so short-term. But our aid actually probably lasts a lot longer.
Wait, how does his incentive to win elections go away in your role? He's still the same.
Because after he wins elections, he doesn't need to give money to the people. That's what happened in the Chavez
But
elections.
he needs
In
to win elections in the future because elections are election year.
Okay,
and
once
elections
he
are next couple
wins elections, what does he do? He consolidates power, and he basically makes it so that he doesn't have to do
years.
future
And then,
elections.
like
That's why
and
once
then a
elections
couple
are over, it
years
doesn't
later,
matter.
there's another election, and
No,
then there's
they
another one after
consolidate.
that.
He literally amended the Constitution so that they have the most power and he doesn't need to do elections. That's what historically has been done, and that's why we would say once elections are
Why
over,
did he
it's
just
super
have an
short-term.
election last year? And why is there more
Because
elections
US
after?
pressure.
All right, man. I'm gonna take a question now.
Okay.
So let's talk about your argument about setting a bad precedent.
Okay.
So you tell me that Venezuela specifically needed because they're a full-on embargo, and then there's 30 other full-on embargoes throughout history.
Yes.
So then why is Venezuela specifically?
Because we are consistent with those other embargoes. We keep them on until our demands are met. But if you lift it on Venezuela, it signals to future countries that as long as they make a bad enough humanitarian crisis like Venezuela did, they can simply outlast sanctions. The United States will capitulate and lift sanctions.
But
That's our
they're
argument.
consistent with the other ones.
No, because those other ones aren't worse humanitarian crises anymore. All of those embargoes are like on Cuba, where it's basically like settled down and
There's
nothing
not a
matters.
humanitarian crisis in Cuba.
It's not as bad as the one in Venezuela. The argument is
What
that
about in
countries-
Iran, where like people are dying because of terrorism, they don't have food, and there's no economic growth? Like,
Wait.
yeah,
How
like,
is that
are you arguing that sanctions make humanitarian crisis better?
The shift is that Venezuela, lifting sanctions on Venezuela means that all this past precedent that we've set with Cuba, Iran, goes away.
Why
Even if
do
it is
you
true
know?
that in the long run people will be like, wait, maybe the United States still enforces it, that takes way too long. Our impact has already triggered 26 different global conflicts. We have sanctions on them right now, which is why we take our impact is in the short term and takes out
They're
your
all
case.
still conflicts and people are still dying.
It's comparatively shorter because of our lives. Alright, we're gonna run out of time. So,
Start off with the overview. The CSIS evidence gives the story of Venezuela. It indicates that before sanctions, inflation was up 1,000% and imports were down 80%. However, due to economic pressure, Maduro had begun to firm. They just say that Maduro's state will never split and will never leave office. We'll agree with them. They're only never going to leave office because Maduro is starting to agree with things and liberalizing the economy. But they completely dropped the Wall Street Journal evidence, which indicates we begin to liberalize the economy, which has decreased inflation by 1,000 times. They completely dropped this, turn it atoms around. They also dropped the Wang from Kevin, which says it outweighs the case on a time frame because even if they solve problems for the short term, if they don't solve for the structural reform of the economy, then the economy is only going to get bad, which means we outweigh it in the long term. But also on a prereq, because even if they do have these things like food and medicine, they can't afford it because inflation is so high, which means we outweigh the case, we do structural reform. Now, let's go to our case. On our contention too about bad precedent, they give a few responses. First, they say we have embargoes in other places. They only give Iran and Russia. But if anything, that only proves our argument because we haven't capitulated any of Russia's and Iran's demands, which is why we still have it. But they also miss the Federico evidence, which indicates that Venezuela is a litmus test because the humanitarian crisis is a lot worse and there's a lot more media coverage. But then they say that the U.S. opposes any military threats and they can always do that. However, there's literally no political capital for any military threats. That's why they always use sanctions. Then they say that in 115 cases, it's only effective 0.5% of the time. But Rogers explains that a lot of sanctions are politically symbolic, which is why those sanctions fail. But they missed the Hassan evidence that they literally called for and read themselves, which indicates that sanctions reduce the conflict of war by 97%. They also say we don't give any warrant for why sanctions decrease the chance of war. It literally comes from Elizabethan case, which indicates that sanctions put economic costs on those who perpetuate the war, which is why they can't even fulfill it. Then they say if anything, it increases aggression. First of all, this is literally uncarded analysis that they just asserted, but if anything, we say it's reverse causal. We only put sanctions on people that are already aggressing. This outweighs their case in two ways. First, on magnitude, because they concede in case that sanctions have only killed 40,000 people, but we say that just one conflict for 1 year kills 280,000 people. Let's extend the case real quick. The warrant comes from Peterson, who indicates that sanctions decrease the chance that when we remove the sanctions before capitulation, it decreases the chance that future sanctions working by 91%. Hassan finds that sanctions reduce the chance of war ending by 97%, which means it's really important because Bennett explains that just 1 year on any conflict that we have 26 of around the world takes 280,000 people. That weighs their case on magnitude. Let's go to their case. So, on their first contention about debt restructuring, we say that the only way any kind of bailout is ever possible is through the IMF. They say that they don't need it, that we never talk about the IMF. Galdano explains that the only way any kind of debt restructuring is possible is an IMF bailout. That's really problematic because the BCC finds that whenever these bailouts, it deregulates the markets. They say that's okay because it increases food in the short term. But in the long term, when you deregulate these markets, it opens up for speculation, which is why they find in the 1990s the banking crisis in Venezuela was caused by speculation because of less reform, which turns their case. That's pretty much dropped. Then on medicine. So, we say that the only reason why Maduro is opening up his economy is because of sanctions. They say it was just one payment and one little bit of aid. The thing is, it's comparative. He wasn't letting any aid in before sanctions were put on, but because of sanctions, we've actually permitted it. But if anything, we say this aid keeps on flowing. It's not just one payment. Then on Petrocaribe, remember, it's going to be oil's cheaper in the short term. That's why they're taking it now, but that's really bad because oil's getting a lot more expensive, so they're going to raise the debt up. We would say that not having Petrocaribe is a good thing because if they go to natural gas, which is 40% cheaper, which means less debt and less debt problems in the future.
Can I see the evidence?
Yeah.
Can I see that they need the IMF specifically?
Yeah. This part's using the IMF. This is like context.
Yes.
case first, then next case. Showing you odd case first. All cycles. Is everyone good? On the new contentions, they're going for their second argument about diversification and liberalization. They drop both of Zane's front lines. First is the corner evidence, which says that Maduro was, in March of 2017, was passing reforms way before. He was A, signing 48 international agreements for privatization, but B, allowing private companies to help with them, which means that their argument is terminally non-unique. But then secondly, they can see the Rockwell evidence, which is in order to diversify and liberalize, you need a capital base in order to establish these industries. This term is read to diversification, but it also applies to liberalization. Because in order to establish capital bases in liberal economies and to help these private companies, you need more money. In order to do that, you need oil diversification. That turns their turn against them, because when you get rid of sanctions, you allow more oil imports, which means that we can A, increase the private sector economy, but B, allow more money so they can privatize faster, which means that we're winning the time frame debate. But then let's go, also these are conceded, we're winning this argument. Go into our case. On the first contention, we don't read debt restructuring at all. Our argument is that there's IMF. It's not about IMF or debt restructuring. It's that bondholders push their debt requirements back. Secondly, there's no warrant as to why the IMF needs to come in, or there's no warrant why they need to deregulate. That's not extended in summary. Thirdly, we would say that they have to pay off bondholders, not requesting IMF restructuring. We called for their evidence. Their evidence says that the IMF and Maduro hate each other. There's no probability of this impact. There's no full contextualization. Go to the second argument on medicine. He extends two responses. He says that actually, I'll extend the argument first. Our argument is very simple. When the United States put sanctions on Venezuela, this decreases the amount of imports. One is not specifically talking about aid, so their responses don't even apply. But I'll address them. First, they say that Maduro wasn't accepting aid before sanctions. One, he was. That's why our evidence indicates before sanctions there was $11 billion of imports, but after sanctions there's $2 billion. It's a five-fold decrease directly because of sanctions. That's conceded. Then they say the aid is going to be flowing in the long term. Three responses. First, we say that one, it's not enough. That's why it only fed a few people. And remember when he was joking around him in Crossfire, food is very going down. But then secondly, we say that there's food shortages now. That's why there's 40,000. Also, our argument is about food is about medicine. There's no they don't clarify that it's about medicine. Thirdly, it's decreasing the status quo. There was only one shipment in December. They don't prove the probability of an increasing shipments in the future, which means that we get access to all our evidence. Remember the Sachs evidence, which says that sanctions have blocked access to essential life-saving medicine that affects 4 million people, which outweighs on scope and probability because it's affecting right now. And when you get rid of sanctions, you allow $6 billion of frozen assets, which saves 40,000 people, and sanctions have already killed 300,000 people. That's a probability debate. Now let's go on to the case. On their second contention, remember we have oil embargoes. We have embargoes and sanctions on 30 other countries with bad humanitarian crisis. They say that Venezuela is the worst. One, no, it isn't. Iran literally funds terrorist organizations. But two, Russia is attacking the Balkanizations and has been for years now. There's literally no warrant for either of the litmus tests. Secondly, we say that the U.S. poses the most influence in the entire world. They say there's no political capital. You've got to be kidding me. One, we have thrown 3 nukes for each leader in each country. So yes, we have political capital. Two, we control the World Bank and the IMF, which means there's always going to be a reason for them not to. On their impact. One, we would say, they can see the Davies evidence, which says that sanctions are effective in less than 5% of the time. They say that it's symbolic. We say, no, our evidence is very specific, that it's economic sanctions. That's because we can't deter them anyways. Also, they say that it'll make our argument worse. No, we say that sanctions specifically make the humanitarian crisis worse. That's what it's doing in Venezuela. That's what it did in literally every country, and that's why there's resource wars in those countries, and it just makes it worse overall.
So, let's talk about Iran. Do we have an embargo on Iran?
Yeah.
No.
Yes, we do.
We have sanctions on Iran.
We have an oil embargo actually because when they pulled out of the U.S. nuclear deal, wait, let me finish.
Yeah, okay.
When they pulled out of the U.S. nuclear deal, we're like, oh crap, you're not following our stipulations. We're not going to follow yours. So they put sectoral sanctions on Iran.
Sectoral sanctions.
Yeah, that's on
I don't
oil.
understand why a
embargo.
full-scale embargo offers any other symbolic nature than.
Okay, because a full-scale embargo shows the highest escalation of U.S. intent. So when we put an embargo on Venezuela, it should be showing that we have intent on following through with our demand.
If you Google, if you just Google Wikipedia, we have 30 embargoes.
Finish?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so we remove our embargo, which is the highest scale of U.S. intent, and then remove it, it shows that we have literally no intentions on following through with our demands.
Carter, if you go on Google and just search up embargoes on other countries,
Yeah,
we have 30 of them.
You told me
Yeah,
you
they're
Wait,
all
yeah.
Yeah.
Wait, can we have a question?
Talk about
Oh
your
yeah,
response.
yeah.
Sorry, that was a question.
You asked me a question. Yeah. So let's go back to this precedent, right?
Yes.
So you said that our argument is uncarded and it's reverse causal.
Yes. Can you explain what that
Yeah,
is?
because when you came up in rebuttal and made that response, you didn't read a card. That's why
Can you tell me what response specifically? I must have missed it.
I feel like warrants trump card.
Okay.
Yeah,
But the other
I just
thing,
want to know what response.
the other thing is we often put the sanctions that we put on countries to end conflict is reverse causal. Like we We put sanctions on countries that are in conflict to end the conflict. Not that we put sanctions on and
My
create
argument was
conflict.
that if they're not working to end the conflicts, and we can give you examples of that, like
Like-
large-scale conflicts.
Yeah, like literally when we put sanctions on Russia, they're like, let me go
Right, so
invade
the reason
Ukraine.
why it's reverse conflict is because tensions between Russia and the United States already existed much before that, so it was not like sanctions with unique causes for why conflict
are they
it was already on that natural trajectory.
Wait, so
Which is why it's
conflict is
reverse
not unique in either world?
No, the argument is that when you put sanctions on, then you reduce the incentive for like these rogue nations to continue conflict, because then you increase the political cost of continuing. That's why the sanctions don't.
That's
cause
not true
more
at all.
war.
That's
And
why.
also-
Why is Iran then funding terrorist proxies?
you
Why is
can-
Russia
you can-
aggressing the Balkans? Why is like North Korea still like launching their big red button? Like I don't
I
know.
understand you can cite examples of conflict ongoing, but you are missing the nuance in the story that we were telling, which comes from Rogers, who writes that when these countries believe that the United States will fall under sanctions, it would comparatively reduces the deadliness of the crisis, and he does an analysis over 50 different points.
wait.
Hassan does
Quick
an analysis
question on
over
that.
50 different
So like,
conflicts.
quick question on that.
Explain.
Wait, I have a quick question. Just what was you saying?
About your explanation.
You said that like it reduces like the deadliness or whatever. So
Yes.
dude, when military generals are fighting, are like, damn, the United States is gonna put more sanctions.
Yes,
I better
because
not
countries
do
believe the
that.
United States will fall through and it will destroy their capacity to rebuild after the war ends. And the evidence is very good. It says, analyzing over 50 different conflicts, that countries that have sanctions on them are significantly shorter in time. It's not that the sanctions don't solve overnight. We don't expect that to happen. It reduces deadliness of the crisis. And we every 1 year on any one interstate conflict kills 280,000 people completely out.
When we're arguing, like, do the countries that the U.S. places sanctions on that are embroiled within conflicts, all these dictators, do they care about economic reform?
Yes, that's why Hassan says you reduce the chance of war by 97%.
Wait,
It also limits
Russia,
the capacity
again,
they
all of
can
these
do.
countries that have sanctions on them don't care about economic
It
reform.
limits their capacity.
I don't know if time is starting.
40 seconds, right?
The structure of this speech, it's going to start on your turn on petrocrete. Then it's going to move to liberalization, and then back to, actually no. It's going to go petrocrete turn, our case about setting bad precedent, then the OV fire time. Is everyone good? Okay. Time begins now. We think the round is over because Ali does not get to the petrocrete turn during a summary that is functionally conceded. The argument is very simple. Oil prices now, because it like subsidizes it, makes it very cheap in the short term, but in the long run they still have to pay it back, which is why they don't transition to natural gas, which is actually cheaper in the long run. In fact, our evidence indicates it would reduce energy poverty by roughly 40% because it is 40% cheaper. This solves for the entirety of Latin America because all these Caribbean countries that were connected to petrocrete now are able to make that shift toward natural gas. This outweighs their argument on scope because they're only impacting to Venezuela, whereas we're impacting to the entirety of the petrocrete countries. This means the round is literally over. No new responses during second final focus. You can literally just end the round right now. Let's go to our case. So, he extends a couple responses, but a lot of them are through ink. He says that Venezuela is worse and that ironically we still have sanctions on them. This proves our argument. We keep sanctions until our demands are met, which is why Venezuela will be a role reversal where we lift sanctions before our demands are met. And they are going to probably say, oh, if we still have sanctions on Iran, that means that we were committed. The problem is, by the time that countries think, oh wait, maybe the United States is still committed, it takes way too long. It is 10 years down the line. All the global conflicts, the 26 that we have sanctions on, all addressed right now. 100,000 people are going to die right away. And we tell you that 1 year on any conflict kills 280,000 people. The weighing is also conceded. It is 7 times their impact. If you believe a fraction of our case, the round is literally over. Then, he says there's no political, there's political capital because they want to have a military presence. There's no political capital to military intervene in all 26 global conflicts. That's why our large evidence indicates that military options are not as strong now. It is the sanctions that we use to deter conflict. That is completely conceded. Then, they say this 5% evidence that sanctions don't work a lot of time. No, our evidence indicates from Rogers, it literally takes into account hate. She says that the reason why it's like that is because the majority of the sanctions that we have are politically symbolic, but these sanctions where we are intent on stopping countries, like conflict sanctions, our Hassan evidence indicates it reduces war by 97%. Finally, he says it increases militarization with no harms at all. He just simply asserts it. But we say it's reverse causal. Tensions existed before these sanctions were met. But specifically, we give you 5 examples from case. Haiti, Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ivory Coast, all countries where sanctions made a comparatively less deadly crisis, which is millions of people and completely outweighs their case. Even if you buy their case completely, the round is over.
covering a lot of bases, so just to keep it simple, I'm going to start on the argument about diversification, which is on the two overviews that Kevin read in rebuttal, and I'll sign questions as best I can. Are my opponents ready?
Yes.
All three judges? All right, let's start. It's done. They concede the Rockwell evidence that says that in order for diversification to ever happen, sanctions need to be lifted because that prioritizes the fact that they need a capital base from oil revenue that are being cut by sanctions in order to diversify. That's why the last time diversification happened, which was really helpful for the Venezuelan economy, and they can see that when they read the response themselves, it was done because Chavez used oil revenues to use as a cushion so diversification could happen. That's really important because it leads to an increase in economic growth because they're making more money from oil, and B, an increase in diversification. That always on strength of link because it's 100% conceded. Also, they concede that diversification is a good thing with many positive impacts because it lowers the chance of future recessions. Let's go on to their case. First, on this idea about setting a bad precedent, there's a lot of problems here. First, they don't really handle the idea that there's embargoes on 30 other countries other than Venezuela. They say that we haven't capitulated on any of their demands. That's not our point of our argument. Our argument is that other countries have sanctions, so even if we lift them on Venezuela, other countries see that we still have this really strong international force. Then they tell you, then remember the response that the U.S. posed an inherent threat outside of sanctions. We're the most globally influential, both militarily and economically. We tell you that there's no capital to intervene. We tell you that the threat that the United States poses is enough because they have so many resources. That means that there's no threat. People realize that the United States has a threat. Additionally, remember that sanctions are designed to make things worse. That's why there's a humanitarian crisis happening in Iran, in Cuba, and in Venezuela right now. There's no way that they make things better. Let's go on to our case. On this Petrocaribe turn, they extended past the front lines. Remember, first of all, I tell you that there's no terminal impact here. Additionally, they don't implicate it until final focus. There's no point in evaluating it. Second, third, we dropped it because they dropped the front line, which means we didn't really think they were going to go for it. Remember that we tell you ourselves that people are always going to turn to the most profitable sources of revenue. They're always going to go to cheaper sources of gas. Go to our second argument about imports is 100% conceded in final focus, meaning it's the easiest place to go. We tell you that right now sanctions are blocking imports from going to the United States. That's why before sanctions there was $11 billion worth of imports going into Venezuela. Now it's $2 billion. That represents a five-fold increase. That's really important because of this, 4 million Venezuelans lack medicine. 40,000 have already died, which means we win the probability debate, and 300,000 are on the immediate brink of death. That means that you must lift a firm now because it's way more urgent. We are way on time on urgency because you have to do it now, and probability because we know that all people have already died. Vote for the impacts that count.